My name is Jon Brown. I'm a Mac admin and Systems Security Officer for Montage Marketing Group. We're an experiential marketing agency based out of the Washington, D.C. and Virginia area, and I'm really glad to be here. The goal of my talk today is to talk about the importance of approaching cybersecurity from the perspective of implementing good strategy before the implementation of overall good cyber tools. The goal is not to discount the use of tools when it comes to solving challenges in the cyber sphere, but rather to hopefully help broaden your mindset in terms of what cybersecurity is and your overall responsibility when it comes to implementing strategies for it. And then thinking about what that means for your company and for your organization. This is mostly suited for individuals that find themselves in a position where they manage cyber security initiatives for their organization, or perhaps they're working with a cybersecurity team, or maybe they're looking to move more into a cybersecurity role within their organization, or maybe they're just sort of like in an ad hoc security role in their company currently, and they just need more information about how to approach it. I've been a Mac admin for many years. I've worked in the space as a consultant, as a business owner, and most recently moved into the cybersecurity space as an employee. I'm excited to share my journey from IT administrator to consultant to information systems security officer, and how I'm building and thinking about cybersecurity as a Mac admin for Montage Marketing Group, the company that I now work for. But first, a quick overview in my mind of what cybersecurity is before we get started, so that we're all on the same page. And then I'll lay out exactly how I built the strategy for my cybersecurity program for the organization that I work for, and what I encountered as a new systems security officer when I came on board in the first few days of working there. All right. I love this slide. All right, cybersecurity is the convergence of people, processes, and technology that come together to protect organizations. Notice that technology is the last part in this slide. People, that's you and I, people, we're first. Without us, there is no cybersecurity. We're the first line of defense. As technicians, I think we sometimes forget that. I don't know why we forget that, but I think we do. Processes, cybersecurity, it's 99% documentation, writing. That's what it is. You don't like writing policies and procedures and then enforcing them, and then potentially making enemies with your coworkers because you're enforcing them. Highly recommend that you not get into cybersecurity. Finally, technology. Technology can do amazing things to help automate and make our lives better, but let's be clear, most cybersecurity technology is being used on the defense. What we need, however, are more amazing people to develop great technology for use on the offense as well. This is a very high-level view of cybersecurity. All right. CIA triad. At its core, cybersecurity centers around confidentiality, integrity, and availability, typically of data or information. I'm citing this from the Microsoft Cybersecurity 101 GitHub page. That QR code will take you right to it. And I'll have QR codes kind of like littered throughout this presentation, but I'll also have this presentation fully downloadable at the end as well. So you'll be able to get all of this and all the links. So don't feel like you need to scan throughout, but if you want to follow along, feel free to do so. Confidentiality is the process of protecting data and information from unauthorized access attempts. For example, only people who need to see information are able to access it. That's access control and permissions of systems that you and I administer, right? Integrity refers to protecting the accuracy and trustworthiness of data contained within environments and not allowing the data to be altered or amended by unauthorized individuals. So not allowing someone to modify their driver's license so that they could buy alcohol, for example, underage. Another way to look at this is from a systems administration perspective is encryption or file hash validation, right? There are specific types of attacks that target availability that we have to be aware of. For example, DDoS attacks or distributed denial of service attacks. Another way of looking at availability is server uptime or cloud system uptime. So we're getting more focused now in terms of what the core of cybersecurity is, but we're not getting any tangible guidelines on how to actually do any of these things. So what makes up cybersecurity? Here's where we get sets of directions in a sense. Here's how I like to think about it. Different organizations, companies, and government agencies created frameworks, laws, and technology platforms that set forth certain guidelines for certain sectors to apply a baseline compliance to their organization and tools to allow them to do their jobs in a secure manner, and laws for securing the data that flows through them that protects the privacy of the users that use them. That's a simplistic way of outlining what we're seeing on this slide. So we're breaking it down into three different sections. We've got frameworks, we've got security, and we've got laws. In the framework section, and this is not a comprehensive list, this is just an example. The framework section, we've got SOC 2. SOC 2 is a framework that you might need if you make cloud software, if you're hosting data in the cloud. NIST CSF, CSF stands for Cybersecurity Framework, is a voluntary cybersecurity framework created for any business to adopt. There are offshoots of this that we'll talk about later in the presentation. PCI DSS is a financial framework to protect credit card data. So if you store credit card data, then you'll need to use this one. ISO 27001. It's mostly required if you're an international organization or do business internationally. High Trust, it's very robust and much more comprehensive set of cybersecurity controls, similar to NIST, but much more complete and more expansive. Moving on to security. This is what you and I are more familiar with. Security is its own layer, and as you can see here, there's lots of security types, and each of them are robust in their own right. Each of them have their own, in many cases, their own set of tooling, their own experts, their own fields, their own sets of certifications, their own requirements, and their own industry sectors. So infrastructure, cloud, network, user education, disaster recovery, for example. Finally, laws. As you can see, we have HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA. These are laws or acts passed by federal or state legislatures. They're not frameworks. While they have language in them with guidance, the language is not specific. It's very broad, which is why in many cases, when organizations look to seek compliance with these laws, they sometimes look at multiple frameworks that cross off all the requirements of the law. So if we take HIPAA, for example, I might choose High Trust or NIST CSF as two frameworks that would encompass both of all the requirements of the HIPAA law. This is typically what's called as crosswalking a framework, or looking at multiple frameworks to meet a single set of requirements. All right, there's a great article in Wirecutter that you can get to on this slide that I highly recommend checking out that talks about the US states' privacy laws. We have over 54 of them, if you can imagine, which again makes cybersecurity even more complicated depending on which region you happen to be operating in. The New York Times also has a great article on the state of our privacy laws here in the USA. So if you're looking for information, these are great, great resources. The fact is that laws in the USA are so regional, it makes fully understanding how to respond to a cybersecurity event from a legal perspective a very complicated endeavor, which is why most organizations have legal counsel to advise them on those matters. While that's typically the case, it's still up to the cybersecurity professional, in most cases, the IT professional, to be aware of the local laws in their area and their organization's responsibilities on how to respond to them. So I'm quoting the article from Wirecutter here. Currently, 3 states in the US have 3 different comprehensive consumer privacy laws: California, CCPA, and its amendment CPRA, Virginia, VCDPA, and Colorado, COLO-PA. Regardless of which state a company is located in, the rights and laws apply only to people who live in these states. The map here shows, as of 2021, the US state privacy legislation tracker. Again, this is all just to highlight how regional and how complex cybersecurity is in terms of compliance and cyber law and privacy law. Remember, this all ties back to the core principle that we talked about before with the CIA triad: confidentiality and privacy. All right, so let's put it all together. Let's say that I have a nonprofit organization that's based in San Francisco and has offices in Washington, D.C., and also an office in Brussels. They have a site-to-site VPN to each office, and all of their systems are cloud-based, just to keep things simple. What would the recommended cybersecurity program be for that kind of organization? I would say, in terms of keeping things very prescriptive, based on what we saw in the previous slides, a framework would likely be NIST-CSF and PCI if they accept and store credit card data. Let's assume that they do. They're a nonprofit, they might. Security, cloud, obviously. Network, they have site-to-site VPNs. Encryption, end user education, disaster recovery, they probably have it all. Laws, in terms of laws, they need to follow CCPA and GDPR since they're headquartered in California and since they have offices in the EU. Now we have a roughed-in idea of what we need in terms of the program that we have to follow, but we have to dig deeper. Remember, people, processes, and technology. When thinking about cybersecurity, it's important to understand that each company is different, so a one-size-fits-all approach is never going to work. And that brings us to the tools. Look at all these tools. Super easy to get sucked into a world where you get so focused on the tool. I mean, there's so many to choose from. And we use these tools all the time. It's super easy to get focused on the tools that we use to do our jobs. In fact, in 1989, in an interview, Steve Jobs himself was quoted as saying, "I think humans are basically tool builders, and the computer is the most remarkable tool we've ever built." We're here at Mac Admins Conference because we love the Mac. And we love how it amplifies and enables the work that the people we support every day use it. That last bit there is also a quote by Steve as well. However, when it comes to cybersecurity, because there are so many moving parts, I think it's really risky to think about it starting with the tools. I think rather it's more important to think about it as a system and understand why the tools exist, and then better understand if you really need them for your organization. Just because there are tools out there doesn't mean you need all of them. Your company's compliance requirements, security needs, and obligation to cyber law will be different from one organization to the next. If you're a nonprofit, for example, then your situation will be far different than a company that trades on Wall Street. Not just in compliance, but in regulatory needs and security needs as well. All right. So when I first came on board at Montage Marketing Group, what was clear was they needed a lot of strategies that would guide them, and not just technical strategies, but business level strategies. Luckily for me, I have some business experience. I ran a company for 10 years, and during that time, I had experience building departments and learning how to navigate approval processes. Since I was essentially being tasked with building a new department from scratch, that's where I knew I had to start. Now, Montage Marketing had been around for a while, 10 years, and had been supported mostly by MSP contractors until I was hired. Part of my job was to evaluate the current MSP provider. Their role at the company was IT help desk, managed cybersecurity, and managed IT. I'm going to walk you through the strategy in the next few slides that I created for them. The process I created, which worked for me, is a cyclical one. And it can work for you as well. It starts with creating a strategy and going through a strategic approval process. For me, that strategy was writing down what I wanted to accomplish in the first year based on the goals they put before me. Then that naturally fed into a budgeting process that I went through to pick the tools that I ultimately selected to support the security and compliance efforts for the organization and the rationalization for those decisions. That led to a formal vendor review process that I built out, and a tool selection process, and a tool approval and implementation process, which of course full circle fed back into the strategy and strategy approval loop. Notice when I started building the strategy and then after it was approved, then I put together a budget for the tools needed to follow through on the strategy. The budget was created for an allotment of funds for non-specific tooling, meaning I put in the budget what I needed for a backup solution or what I needed for an MDM solution, and later in the process cycle, I took the approved bucket of funds and shopped for a solution within that approved funded allotment. What I have found to be true in most organizations is this: when you ask for money, you're asking for funds for the solution, not the specific tool. Selecting the tool typically comes later in the process. I think many times administrators miss this point. They approach their managers, they say, hey, I want this tool, and they have nothing solid to back that up with. When you present a strategy first, an idea, a methodology to do something that benefits the organization, and then you ask for the tools to support those efforts, you're more likely to get what you're asking for, and in this case, I did. The vendor review process is also very important. For every budgeted item, you need 3 proposals. So that's how I structured my vendor review process. This is critical. Competition and proper evaluation is key in cybersecurity. By getting 3 vendor options, you're always able to present a good, better, best scenario using a needs assessment matrix. The matrix that I created in this case allowed me to rank the needs of the organization for the tool along one edge, and then rank the features of the tools along the corresponding edges of the matrices. Once complete, it's super easy to make the most educated decision. Our policy was to also make sure that we only ever signed 1-year agreements. In addition, we did vendor background checks or security reviews against all vendors, which of course is a security requirement. Now, this business strategy had to be cyclical because after the tool is approved and implemented, we tied that back into the strategy by updating the policies and procedures, which then flowed back into next year's budgeting process, which forces us to review our tool stack each year, forcing us to review our vendors each year, and if needed, go through a tool set needs evaluation, a new evaluation cycle, which kicks off, and so on and so forth. Each year, the strategy evolves as the needs of the organization changes. Next, I had to come up with some cybersecurity strategies. In order to decide what kind of strategies to deploy, I had to understand the organization's requirements. Fully understanding the organization's requirements means listening and asking questions. When I first came on board, I sat down with each department head and I asked them about their needs and challenges as it pertained to their ability to meet their contractual and client-based obligations. Those first key interviews were important in helping me assess some underlying requirements that the organization needed. So what were the needs of the organization? When I came in during my interview, they told me they were required to be CMMC and FISMA compliant. It was pretty clear right away which cyber laws they needed to be compliant with and which frameworks they needed to be matched up with based on that statement. But in terms of their technology stack, that was still very much in flux and needed to be evaluated. As you can see here on this slide, they had a little bit of everything in their environment. A need for disaster recovery, access control, information management, cloud management, infrastructure management, user education. They had it all. Their requirements were NIST 853, which maps back as a framework to FISMA, the FISMA law. CMMC, which maps back to NIST 171, which is the framework requirement for that DoD requirement. As you can see on this slide, that means the implementation of over 400 individual controls. So within each framework, as you can see here, there are 20 domains in NIST 853, 14 in NIST 171, and combined we have over 400 controls, things, individual things that these frameworks say you must do that must be implemented. And most of these controls are not technical controls. Some of them are, but most of them are not. Most of them are policies and procedures that need to be implemented within your organization in order to meet that minimum baseline of compliance for those to meet those standards. In addition to these framework level domains and controls, of course you still have to secure the systems, and those have their own hardening checklists as well. So essentially there are thousands of things that you have to do across multiple platforms in order to ensure that everything is secure. In order to get started, I had to implement a strategy. Now that I had a good business strategy in place, I had to implement a good cybersecurity strategy. But where would I get that? NIST. All right, so luckily for us, NIST has a guide that has a pretty great step-by-step strategy for how to implement a baseline overview plan for implementing a cybersecurity program. Now, this is from NIST's commercial guidelines for their commercial facilities sector. They have guidelines for multiple sectors. So if you're in education, they have guidelines for the education sector. If you're in other sectors, you can find their specific guidelines for your specific sector. And within that document that you can find on their website, you will find a page just like this. And it will give you a step-by-step strategy that you can use as the basis of your to create a basis of your organization's cyber strategy. So step one, prioritize and scope. What does this mean? It means to sit down and identify all the items that are mission critical for your company and rate them, rank them in order of importance and risk. Orient, step 2. How are we setting the requirements for the different systems? How are we going to harden the systems? What tools are we going to use? Right? We're going to use the macOS Compliance Project. Are we going to use a different tool? Write that down. Select them. Research them. This is the stage that we do that. Step 3, create the current profile. Map current cybersecurity and risk management practices. Here we're creating a risk register. We'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but we're writing down our risk management practices. Step 4, we're conducting a risk assessment. If you've never done a risk assessment, NIST has a great guide on how to conduct a risk assessment if you've never done one. Step 5, create a target profile. What we're doing just what it says here. We're describing our desired outcomes. So our desired outcomes is to have hardened systems that are in compliance with our framework requirements. Step 6, look at the things that we're not doing well and analyze them. Step 7, implement an action plan. So we're creating plans for those things that we're doing poorly, and we're setting dates to fix those items. So now again, you're noticing a trend. Cybersecurity is cyclical. These steps, they repeat. They do not end at step 7. They cycle in onto themselves. Each year or each month or each quarter, you will monitor and reassess. This is out-of-the-box cybersecurity strategy that you can implement directly from NIST. All right, so using this as my core strategy, what was I trying to accomplish in my first year and what was my plan? So the goal was to create a cyclical strategy similar to NIST that I could improve upon year after year. I knew that at the core I had some requirements, but I also knew that the owners of the company, they wanted to see a document that conveyed vision more than just hard technical information. After all, this was a strategic plan, not a technical roadmap. My 2 goals were defined pretty simply. Goal 1, as defined on this slide, was to build out a compliance strategy. The vision was to build out an internal compliance program for the needs of the organization to meet its security posture and compliance goals of CMMC and NIST 853. The document I created outlined how I would create policies and procedures and a process by which the owners would review and sign off on them every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, I'm creating a new set of policies, a new set of procedures. I'm sitting down with the owners. I'm having them review them. We're signing off on them. We're releasing them to the staff, and the organization is adopting them every 2 weeks. We're getting closer and closer to meeting our security baseline slowly over time, right? That was the approach that we came up with that worked for us. The next step was the implementation of a system security plan, which is the evolving document that is updated as you implement policies and systems at your organization. It's the document that shows you how you are securing the systems at your company. So the system security plan also is kind of known as an SSP for short, is a document, like I said, that outlines all of the policies and procedures in shorthand that you've written and has technical diagrams of your systems and is a single document, a point of reference for all of your systems and outlines your plan for securing them. As you implement new policies and procedures, you update your system security plan. The document is a living and breathing document. It never really is finished. You're never really finished writing it. Then I outlined how I would create a business impact analysis. The business impact analysis analyzes the operational and financial impacts of a business. Next step was to undergo a formal risk assessment. That became a critical part of the compliance strategy. Finally, I ended with a disaster recovery plan. Now, there's a lot of other things that I could have or maybe should have included, but these are the things I knew that I could accomplish in my first year. And again, these are the things that are cyclical, the things that I knew that I could improve upon. At the core of these items, I created a security team or a steering committee to guide the organization, which consisted of myself, the COO, and the CEO, to ensure that we were in constant sync. Now I had a strategy, but there's a little twist. I had to account for NIST 800-171, or CMMC, which is an audit readiness framework. So that required me to have an additional strategy. So we have two frameworks. I had to have two different strategies. This means that eventually I need to be able to pass an actual audit for compliance because, again, it's an audit-based framework. SOC 2, ISO, also audit-based frameworks. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is also directly applicable if you're going to or through any of those types of framework compliance. Also, if you're implementing or if you're handling CUI, which is controlled unclassified information, the following slides will be super helpful for you. All right, so for CMMC, there's a great resource out there called CMMC Awesomeness. CMMC Awesomeness is a website that has created an amazing off-the-shelf CMMC strategy and has also created an equally amazing flow chart for the implementation of their CMMC strategy. And here's what it looks like. All right, so I'm sharing this flow chart just to illustrate some of the overlapping features of their strategic thinking that we have illustrated already in the NIST framework. So as you can see, it's very similar to NIST. It's based on NIST 800-171, but there's some key differences that I'm going to point out. So in step 2, we're talking about creating an assessment boundary. So this is a key element and difference between a normal framework that has no assessment. So like NIST CSF has no assessment, but CMMC and SOC 2 and ISO, they have assessments. So you have to create a boundary. And the way that you create and scope a boundary dictates what you secure. So if you are securing the whole organization, that whole organization is in scope, then your security plan has to include everything within the company. But if the scope of the contract, let's just say only encompasses the graphic design department of your company, and that includes only 2 computers and a server, then now the scope of the audit is much more focused and much more narrowed. And it's easier to secure only that small targeted area. All right. All right, in this slide, step 4, we're seeing a need for more documentation. So here we're seeing that we need a network architecture diagram. And then step 5, we're seeing that we need a gap assessment. So if any of you have ever heard of gap assessment, this is kind of where a gap assessment comes into play. A gap assessment is part of the cybersecurity strategic process. And again, as you find issues and you document them into what's called Plan of Actions and Milestones, or otherwise known as POAMs. And then you schedule them for remediation. So that's what I had to do at my company. We're seeing an overlap in the generic NIST planning a little bit here. Now we're developing processes and procedures. In my original strategy, this is where my policy reviews cadence comes into play. And finally, implementing a risk management program. A risk management program in terms of this overall strategic plan is a process of identifying risks, typically by doing a risk assessment, which starts by filling out a risk register. A risk register is in cybersecurity terms, is a list of cyber events and the likelihood that you could recover from that event, and then coming up with mitigating controls or actions to reduce the organization's overall risk. A good example of this would be if your company has a server that has sensitive data that needs to be online, then you may want to ensure that that server has a redundant hard drive, or maybe that server has a redundant ISP, or maybe put the server in the cloud. Don't have an on-premise server, just saying. All right, moving on. Finally, implementing incident response plan. Not only did we have to document our incident response plan, but we had to have a plan for actually carrying out and being notified of incidents within our organization, which meant that we had to have a method for ingesting and looking at events. So that meant we had to have a tool to do that. So a SIM tool, or a security information and event management tool, is a tool that typically integrates with all of your cloud providers or desktops over an API connection, collects and aggregates all of your system logs into a centralized place, typically in the cloud, and then once all of those logs are in a centralized place, they can be reviewed, enriched, and managed by a SOC, otherwise known as a Security Operations Center, and then they're staffed by security analysts who review those logs and look for events that you might need to be aware of. So this is all part of situational awareness and incident response. And again, now we're getting closer to the technology requirements, so getting closer to picking the right tools. So that's a great segue into security strategies. So for security strategies, I had to come up with a plan to ensure that as a team of one, that I had the ability to keep our systems safe and secure. And this is where I feel the tools are actually really, really important. Tools are the heartbeat of the security area, and without all the strategic thinking that we just went through, and I know it was boring, so thanks for bearing with me. That, without all that strategy, picking the wrong tools, and we can implement them really poorly or utilize them incorrectly. Goal number 2, security. So on this goal, again, following my cyclical nature, my ultimate goal was to develop my own internal IT team or security department. But for my first year, the goal was to do a security review and audit of all the systems at my organization. Of course, this led to an organic stage where I would have to report on my findings. And again, that led naturally to a network security review, a security review of Azure, Office 365, our Windows workstations, Mac OS workstations, and all of our other platforms. Each system had to be reviewed against the security baseline and compliance guidelines. Then for each platform, I had to come up with a strategic technical project plan for implementing those requirements. And I'll be going through a few of these in the next few slides. The next step or phase was to create a maintenance and monitoring program for ensuring that those systems stay secure over time, and then a plan for remediation. So that's, of course, vulnerability management and patch management. Those are the things that we're here to learn about here at Mac Admins. The overall strategy that we employed here was one of let's utilize the capabilities of the tools that we already have to ensure that we're maximizing the security capabilities of what we're already paying for before going out and buying new tools. This meant we needed to reevaluate the capabilities of the tools that we had before going out and buying new ones. Remember, I came in, I inherited a whole tool set, which meant that an evaluation of them still needed to happen. All right, so the first thing I had to do was handle the workstations. Since I knew I had to be compliant with FSMA and CMMC, the MSP that we worked with initially used Adigy for macOS management, and of course, we already had Intune for Windows management, so those were my resources that were in use at the time that I came on board. After we evaluated these tools at the time, they seemed okay, and we maximized the use of them by implementing all the security capabilities that they had. For Adigy, this meant implementing and enforcing a NIST 853 baseline to all workstations. This worked out pretty well. NIST, if you're not familiar with Adigy, they actually have integrated the macOS security program right into their backend, so it was really easy to deploy. And for Intune, this meant enabling Microsoft Defender, Firewall, Bitdefender, and other such policies, and enabling the security baselines as well on all Windows platforms. Using additional open source tools like SAP Privileges and freemium platforms like Admin by Request, we were able to bring our administrative rights policy back in line with our requirements and organizational needs. Our business strategy of bringing IT in-house, however, led us to broadening how much control we had on how we were able to meet our overall security and compliance needs. So that brings us to our after state. Ultimately, we ended up migrating to Jamf Pro, and we implemented Jamf Connect, and we hardened the workstations further to NIST 800-171. So NIST 853 and NIST 800-171, they overlap, they intersect. So there's a large number of requirements in those two frameworks that are identical. And so when we went from NIST 853 to NIST 800-171, we only added maybe 20 additional hardening controls when we migrated over from the previous framework to the more restrictive framework of 171. So it wasn't a huge migration or lift. We partnered with Arctic Wolf. On the Windows side of the house, we used a tool called Hardening Kitty and Intune to roll out their compliance framework. I implemented GPOs and validated them using the Hardening Kitty tool. We also implemented Admin by Request for admin elevation for Windows, as we talked about. We implemented security for macOS using the macOS Security Compliance Framework. And if you haven't used the macOS Security Compliance Framework, there's a QR code on this slide that will take you to the talk that Bob Gendler gave at Mac Admins a few years ago, which was really amazing. So I highly recommend that you check that out. If you've never used Hardening Kitty before, then I highly recommend checking that out as well. It's a Windows tool for checking the compliance of a Windows platform for overall Windows compliance. Remember, I have a mixed hybrid environment, and we still need to ensure that I was finding comparable tools for the same platforms. So that was a key element in my strategy. Hardening Kitty is the closest overall tool that I could find that aligned with the macOS Security Compliance Project, but for Windows. There's also a great article on Microsoft's blog that I'll have linked at the end of this presentation that shows you how to create STIGs in Microsoft Intune and apply those to Windows workstations. And then, of course, because we work with the DoD releases STIG baselines that you can import directly into Intune and then apply to your Windows fleet, which was super helpful for our organization. And if you haven't connected with Bob, I'm just going to pop this slide up here. Highly recommend that you do so. This QR code will take you to his LinkedIn page. He's a huge contributor to the Mac Admins community, and I am super appreciative of his contributions. Bob and his team created the macOS Compliance Project. All right. So in the last few months, I've implemented a disaster recovery plan Implemented a more robust security awareness and training cadence with a variety of different tools. Implemented a security incident response plan for the staff and for the leadership. Wrote an acceptable use policy. Contributed to the organizational handbook. Helped contribute to their code of conduct policy. Started conversations around creating a BYOD policy. Started conversations around revamping their overall documentation and organization structure, which in my mind, this one is really important, because if you can't find the information that you're looking for, this is a problem. This is actually a requirement in NIST 853 when it comes to limiting the reuse of core identifiers. You have to have a standardized naming convention within your organization, so think about that. I've written and reviewed an access control policy, written and reviewed a business impact analysis with the organization owners, which is a critical part of my role in the company because it's really helped establish their risk tolerance profile. We implemented a formal procedure for access control, asset management, or inventory management. Physical inventory is a key part of NIST 853, so monthly physical inventory checks is a key part of is a key element of my role. Vendor reviews, like we talked about before, we implemented a vendor reviews, a security review program, which was important, and how we vet and validate every vendor that we do business with as part of our active supply chain management program. I wrote a business impact and disaster recovery plan with my COO and CEO, and while the goal was to write the system security plan over the course of a year, I ended up having to write it sooner because one of our clients asked for a copy of it within my first 4 months of employment. So we got that done sooner. We implemented Arctic Wolf, which I talked about earlier, and Drata, which is the tool that we use to keep all of the policies stored, and the tool that we use for vendor security. Drata is the tool that we're going to be rolling out for backups. And Box.com is the tool that we picked for rolling out the storage of our sensitive and classified information. All right. Finally, we implemented BitLocker and FileVault with the help of Escrow Buddy. We hardened our Office 365 environment using a tool called Harden 365 and Sotera Inspect. Both really, really great projects that I highly recommend checking out. Linked here in the slide. Again, I'll have those linked out at the end. We checked and validated our network security using the Meraki security baseline tool. Again, it's a great open source Python script that I highly recommend checking out on GitHub. I'll have that linked out as well. We implemented Cisco Umbrella, and then of course we continued to leverage Arctic Wolf for the additional requirements for NIST 853 and 171. So here it is. This is our tool stack that we landed on, and this is what we use. And again, yeah, we use tools, but we use them in concert with the strategies that we talked about before. So the tools are part of a wider strategy. And we got to these tools by creating the strategies, not by picking the tools first and then creating the strategies. Along with these tools, here are the processes, controls, and policies that we also use to support these tools. Now, these are just a sampling of some of the resources that we use, but most of the items that I used were publicly available and free. So policies that we used were referenced from the SANS Institute as well as Drata, our GRC tool. But luckily for me, we already had a good baseline of some policies, so I just needed to write a lot of good procedures. Most cybersecurity is writing, like I said before, and about 50% of it is technical writing, and the other 50% is policy and procedural writing. If I have to pass on one piece of advice, start working on your writing skills. Don't rely on ChatGPT or template policies. What sets amazing cybersecurity experts apart from the rest is their ability to write, which is also true of amazing systems administrators as well. All right. Cybersecurity is more than just tools. I hope this conversation helped you realize that in the grand scheme of cybersecurity, that it's just one part of the overall cycle of cybersecurity. While it's a critical part of it, it's not the only part. When companies only focus on that part, they're really missing out, dangerously so, on the bigger mission of what it means to think about and manage risk for their organization at large. Beware of any company that markets themselves as a one-stop shop solution for all your cybersecurity needs. Cybersecurity is so complex and so unique for each organization, no single tool or set of tools could possibly be a one-size-fits-all solution for any industry, organization, or company. And this is the cycle. This is the zoomed out sort of view of how all of those mini cycles that I showed you before fit into the larger cycle. At the end of the day, we picked the right processes, technologies, and tools that came together to protect our organization. Remember, you can pick tools and they can secure your systems, but they can't tell you in most cases the legal requirements you're bound by in your state depending on the type of event you happen to encounter. You can get policy templates and implement good procedures, but you still have to be the one to respond to an actual security event and put those into practice. And if you're outsourcing security entirely, then you still need to hold that company and their team accountable for the tools they implement and the policies and procedures they follow, because at the end of the day, you can't fully pass on your organization's risk. It still falls on your shoulders. Cybersecurity as a whole is far more complex than just securing systems. It's understanding people, processes, and technology, and how they work together, and in doing so, managing internal risk. You can download this presentation. You can also get all the templates that I talked about, sanitized policies that you can use at your company, and all the links that I talked about throughout the organization, all on the GitHub repo. And I also hope that you give me some good feedback. I was a little nervous. And I will open it up for questions.
So you said that you have one-year contracts for your tools. What does your review process look like for those tools? How, like ahead of time, like how soon are you starting the process for reviewing, and how many people are part of that process?
Yeah, so I created the security sort of like review committee, and so that committee is involved in all the review processes. And typically because we open up the vendor review process to new vendors, we open that up 3 months prior to any contract expiration. And so what we have is we have Drata, which is our GRC platform, and Drata has a vendor area where we manage all of our vendors, and Drata will send us a notification 3 months prior to any contract expiration and let us know, like, hey, this vendor's contract is about to expire, and then that's when we will start doing a RFP for new services if we're unhappy. If we're happy, then we continue working with the vendor. So it's not a requirement that we have to leave every single time and find a new vendor. It's only a requirement if they're not meeting our needs.
Okay, so you're not, so just so that you're not locked in, right?
Right,
That's what
yeah.
you're doing. Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, I think that my CEO kind of, that the thought process was, well, if we renew maybe 2 or 3 times in a row, then we might consider a longer term contract, because then that shows like that they're more reliable. But we want to make them earn that.
You mentioned when you were looking at the different NIST scopes that to create, I think you called it the boundary around your environment, and that it was a lot easier to create a boundary around the graphic design department rather than the entire organization. Is that something you did in like the initial kickoff of this project, or did you scope the whole organization right off the bat?
Yeah, so for us, and I did kind of skip over this in my notes a little bit because I got lost. But for us, the requirement for CMMC is the flow of CUI. So CUI is controlled unclassified information, and that is any information that is coming from the Department of Defense to us. So if that comes in from email from the DoD and then it comes through our email system, then our email system is in scope because that CUI is flowing through our email system. So then if it's also going to specific users, then those users are in scope. So anything I can do to limit the scope, so if I can set up a separate domain and a separate email environment for the flow of CUI, then now I can segregate or separate out that environment and create a smaller boundary. It's always advisable that you do that, so that when you get to a point where you're ready for audit, you're not actually scoping to the entire organization. It's always advisable, at least in my opinion.
Is your plan to expand out to the entire organization over time, or try and keep that scope limited just based on the complexity?
Always trying to keep it limited is the goal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, I'm a one-person shop. If I have a larger team, I might be okay with it, but yeah, there's a lot of hands up.
Oh, hey, John. We use Drata as well, and
Yeah.
I was wondering how much customization did you do for the CMMC and NIST program inside Drata itself? Like, did you go customize all the sub-controls?
Yeah, so they haven't, so you already know this, they haven't mapped the CMMC. So after we purchased CMMC, we asked for a refund, and we asked them to just give us NIST 800-171, which is basically the same as CMMC. So, but you can ask them to map the CMMC as close to 171, which they were able to do for some of our, from what I've heard, for some of their other customers. So I didn't have to do anything. I just asked them to do it for me.
Okay. But the sub-controls, do you customize them or do you leave it as is?
I just left them as is.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
From your presentation, I understand you have brought a lot of changes in your organization within a short period of time.
Yeah.
And in one point you mentioned that like you kind of implemented changes in intervals.
Yeah.
Can you speak about like the challenges you faced, like how user accepted, the implementation because you implemented in intervals?
Mm-hmm.
Were they kind of overwhelmed about the changes that you were introducing? And especially like there would have been, regular users, power users, and you are a single person. How did you kind of overcome all of those?
Yeah.
Any best practices?
Great question. So most of the technical changes were kind of transparent to the end user because we were able to use a lot of great open source tools that you're probably kind of familiar with to help migrate MDM to MDM. There wasn't a ton of change on the Windows side. They stayed enrolled in Intune. So from the technical stuff, there wasn't a lot of user-facing change. In terms of policy change, sure, there was a lot because remember, we were doing 2 to 3 new policies every 2 weeks. But what we decided to do was, sure, we were creating new policies and we were signing off on them, but we weren't shoving them into the end user's face right away. We were just amending those, and then every quarter, we were just telling everyone, hey, we have some new policies that you need to review. And Drata is a great platform for reviewing policies. So users can go in, they scan the policies, they sign off that they have accepted them, and they have questions, and then they can kind of reach out. Most of our policies, the way that we wrote them, And because we're a smaller organization, I think we could kind of get away with this. Most of our policies are 1 to 2 pages long. They didn't need to be super long, and they didn't need to be really complicated either. So it doesn't take a long time for our users to read them and to understand them. They don't need to be overly complicated to meet the requirements of the framework either. So don't feel like you have to make them overly complicated. They just need to meet the essence of the requirements. So an access control policy, for example, doesn't need to be 20 pages long. It can just be a page and a half long and just talk about the things that are important to your organization. And the things that, like what's important to our organization was defined by conversations that I had with my CEO and COO, and they were the ones that set that tone for me, not me. It wasn't my decision. And so then once we had those documents, we either added them to the handbook, which made for an easy sort of like method of acceptance, because the users were already used to accepting regular changes to the handbook on a quarterly basis anyway, or just telling them that they had some new policies to review in Drata. But you can do that in any manner. Like you could do that in a Teams folder or put it in a Box directory or whatever. But great question.
I noticed you selected Cisco Umbrella for your DNS protection. I wanted to see if you could give me a little more insight into it, if the major priority there was a vertically integrated stack with a single vendor as opposed to potentially a third party that you might maybe find superior, like Cloudflare seems to be popular. If you could just...
Yeah, I mean, they were predominantly, again, like one of the requirements that I had was let's use the tools that we already have and maximize the use of them. And since most of our networks were already Cisco based, and since we were going with Arctic Fox and they already had a native integration with most Cisco based tools, it seemed like a no-brainer to go with Cisco Umbrella as the native solution for DNS filtering. They didn't have any solution like that. Again, it was kind of like a double level solution in my mind, because you can integrate Cisco Umbrella directly with the in-office Meraki platform and then also put it on the endpoints, and then you're good to go. And then those logs all filter in through the Arctic Wolf platform as well.
Oh, so you're not necessarily like living in the Cisco Umbrella portal, which is pretty not ideal. You're kind of more living in the Arctic Wolf platform. Okay, that makes sense.
All the logs are going into Arctic Wolf, and then the SOC analysts are reviewing those.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you guys for your time and attending my talk. I appreciate it.